and welcome to Russell Walker Meets on Glasgow Chamber of Commerce TV. Few industries, if any, will remain untouched by the effects of coronavirus. One in particular is suffering hugely, and that's travel. Airlines, hotels, tourist attractions are all under threat. So to put that into some sort of perspective, I'm joined by John Green, whose company, the JG Collection, represents some of the most prestigious hotels around the world. One is Crossbasket Castle near Blantyre, which is also a member of Glasgow Chamber of Commerce. John, how is Crossbasket and its team led by Rob Baird coping with the lockdown?
Well, as with most of the properties that we have in the collection, a great number of the staff were furloughed initially. We have obviously in terms of hotel terminology, key workers, and Rob, the general manager, and Sharon, who works in sales, are working there at the moment. So it went through phases originally, Russell. You can imagine a lot of people were contacting us, particularly with a reputable wedding business like that, particularly those that were concerned with the immediate versus the future. So it was looking at those that were coming to us initially, and that's not just weddings, it's a great number of leisure, some corporate business, satisfying their initial inquiries. And you can imagine most of them were looking, as most of the industry did, to cancel. We were looking to postpone as an industry and try to move people into dates. So there was a lot of activity at the very beginning. It's slowed down as time has gone on now, but obviously we're working like many on the news that we're getting out of government as to how we can then satisfy that demand, or those rescheduled weddings, leisure stays, corporate stays into the future, and we'll be led by the government on that.
Looking at weddings, because that's obviously a big market for Crossbasket and hotels like Crossbasket, how difficult do you think it's going to be to get back into the swing of things, get that place back in the market in this very competitive area of business?
There is going to be some distancing. We know that. We have to react to that as well. We have to look. But then, of course, you have on the second side, the second challenge is, particularly with the weddings business, is does a bride want half a wedding? Given what we know about distancing as we move forward, would you be prepared to have I suppose what a COVID compliant wedding will look like when we're given that direction, or would you want to postpone it further? So I think most businesses would have liked, or would want to do, as Crossbasket have done, given the option to the bride and the grooms, and on a phenomenally important day in their lives, is to reschedule that into the future, but not to disadvantage those that will wish to get married in the future. So effectively, hotels have parked their business, let's say for the majority of 2020. In order to recover that, probably most hotels will use that September period onwards into the first quarter to catch up with themselves in the perfect world, and then beyond that, start looking at new business.
What do you think a COVID-19 compliant wedding would look like?
If distancing is involved, obviously numbers will be reduced. But if you look at the wedding market in particular, most weddings that most people go to, that they're involved, that there's a ceremony of some description. You can obviously separate people from that. You can probably move the officials further away from the bride and groom, and you're hoping that the families have lived together. There's so many different things at the end of the day, which is why people are looking to the science, the testing, and the vaccine, and the apps and the technology that we've built over the years as somewhat of a solution to this. And you throw that all on top of what is possibly the busiest and brightest day for a bride and groom. They may well step back from that and say, I just don't want to do this. I don't want to do this without having X people there. I've paid for this. I want this. Why not we delay it? So we're really, really conscious of that. And we're probably relying on the science and the government to come forward first on that, as we are with most parts of the business.
Just a year ago, figures were showing the hotel business in Scotland was booming. So the tourist season is getting longer. Hotels are popping up in retail parks and conference centres. The SEC Hydro in Glasgow has a hotel, 2 hotels, I think, near it. In fact, at one point in 2018, Glasgow's hotel sector was growing at 8 times the UK average, with occupancy rates up almost 80%. and Aberdeen, Inverness and Edinburgh, where I know you have hotels in all of those areas, they were also experiencing growth. So how quickly do you think the hotel trade can recover from the coronavirus pandemic?
I suppose the narrative really is people are looking towards September now. I think when this all began, people were looking that this was going to turn around very quickly. It was going to be a blip. I think most people that you discuss with now, particularly in our industry, are looking towards September for at least I suppose, a resumption of what I'm now terming a new normal, whatever that looked like. Again, we're I suppose, reliant on the government to give us some guidance on that. We see clearly the narrative about domestic business, and domestic we always think is going to come back and bounce back in every country. And I obviously have hotels further afield, so I know that that's the case and that's the narrative. But when you're looking at domestic business, there's a number of factors that come into that. You only need to pick up the papers to see swathes of people moving to certain areas of the country. What is the sentiment going to be around that piece? When, for argument's sake, Scotland, which has a very different geographic scenario to somewhere like the City of London or the Cotswolds, etc. You've got a lot of rural areas there, and a lot of movement within it. What will the local population be like when that movement then starts to kick back in? So I think it's important to be very positive about the narrative and bring people along on that journey. We know how important. I know you've given some broad figures. I had a look myself when I spoke with Visit Scotland about this, and they estimated tourism was worth up to about 10.5 billion to the Scottish economy, about 206,000 jobs. Expenditure on it in 2019 was 5.5 billion from visitors to Scotland. And if you put it in context, it's roughly about 1 in 12 jobs. And if you look at the worldwide side of this, you've got, I think, 1 in 11 people in 2015, this was a Skift report that came out, were employed in the hospitality industry. That's 284 million jobs, 7.2 trillion to the global GDP. Just to put that in context, it's the entire population of Brazil. So I think possibly we have to look at how we are going to have to emerge from this, because everything has been pretty much put on pause, and therefore occupancy isn't going to pick up the way it left. It's going to be gradual, and it's going to come with consumer confidence, and it's going to go from the tone and the communication we're making throughout the industry. The challenge is going to be balancing, as it is in industry across the world at the moment, is how do we get out of a recession, particularly in tourism, where it's been so important. I mean, if you look at Scotland, and there were some statistics and some narrative about B&B coming back a little bit sooner because they're smaller and private, and the smaller boutique hotels coming out of it because there's a level of privacy. If you think about that furlough opportunity that the government has given everybody, some have moved across to retail, into the gig economy and taken sector. We have to get those people back into the industry first and foremost, so we can actually start being the hospitality sector we were before we went out of it as well. There is going to be resistance. There's no doubt about that. And that's why I think it's very, very, very important that both governments and industry get together and make sure the narrative is very positive about that contribution. I mean, those numbers I've given you are enormously important. You know, you don't want the economy to go any further back or slide any further back than it is at the moment. But of course, we're talking about jobs as well as talking about lives being lost at the same time. So it's a really careful balance, and the narrative has to be very, very, very carefully worded.
As an industry insider, John, what I'm really keen to know is, what are people in the business really thinking?
We have to acknowledge the scientific evidence and step back and have a look at that. And I think it's taken some time for our industry to accept that. I think, initially, the pubs are closing, but also at the same time, we have to work in a way that we can then see this reopening. And the problem or the challenge I think we're having at the moment, as you see it in the press this morning with Ryanair, you saw it with British Airways earlier this week, is what that business is going to look like when we come out of it. So there are a lot of people worried about that. and particularly how the government, with the furlough system that's got in place, is going to react to the hospitality industry coming out of it. We're not a shop front. We can't immediately open the doors to distance people to go in and still purchase things. It's going to be a slower process. And I think, most industry sources believe that we're probably the last ones that are going to come out of this and open up. When we come out of this, Russell, I think it's going to look very, very different. I think there are going to be, unfortunately, casualties. I think that's probably widely accepted that's the case.
Where would those casualties mainly come from, John? Which part of the industry do you think?
I think, Russell, it'll be every part of our industry in some shape or form. I mean, if you look at the meeting planning sector at the moment, it is an industry that thrives on bringing people together. First and foremost, that was probably the one that's going to be hardest hit. But also, if you look at the capacity of the airlines, and the capacity was increasing. We're talking about runway developments in Heathrow. We're talking about it in an environmental context, which I know a lot of the other side of this argument is that this is not a bad thing to happen. But at the end of the day, these sectors employ, as you're seeing with British Airways, and 12,000 employees potentially. And I use that term potentially because life is a negotiation at the end of the day. They're looking from their business perspective of what those numbers will look like. Ryanair are looking towards July. I think the airline industry, and I think inevitably the hotel sector is going to be hit, the convention business. But if you expand this a little bit further, you've got attractions, you've got your small roadside cafes, and so on and so forth. I think every area is going to come under pressure to get through this, and there will be casualties in every sector.
You mentioned earlier about, things are going to look different after we come out of this. Can you suggest how that might be? I mean, what are hotels, which is your bread and butter, going to be doing differently in order to survive once this is finished?
Yeah, well, I think as a general industry, and I'm including hotels and other industries at the end of the day, this has been a time to kind of step back and look at your business first and foremost. Now, there will be a certain amount of repercussions as a result of what has happened as to how we can do things moving forward, without a doubt. And we can factor some of those in as well. We are a very social people at the end of the day, and our business is very social. And I think after this, people will want to be social. Whether we have to do that at distance or not is beside the point. So I think the word physical distancing, I hope, becomes a new narrative. There'll be some physical distance within which we can socialize. And if you take that statement and look at your hotel space, you look at the technology that's been provided for us, that, nobody thought that you could use this as readily as you've ever done in your life. But I mean, in some circumstances, in some hotels, you can physically have no interaction with people with one of these in your hand and walk through. So that's a lot easier. But then if you're looking at the luxury market, and I picked up on something one of our Southwest London chefs said, that, and one of our partners, Michel Roux, said the other day, I don't necessarily want to be walking into a fine dining environment and be faced with somebody with a mask on and protective gear and gloves, etc. That's not fine dining to me. So I think restaurateurs are looking at it independently. Hotels are looking at it independently, looking at that check-in procedure, that spacing. When people are going to come down and dine, they'll choose their menu in advance. You have to balance what we can physically do under the new restrictions versus still being able to provide effective hospitality at the end of the day.
And a final word, John, how optimistic are you about the hospitality and travel industry once we get out the other side of all of this?
It's the million-dollar question, as I keep saying, and we're living in a new norm, Russell. None of us have been through this in our lifetime. The word unprecedented has been overused so often. What I do know about our industry and what I love about it is its resilience. It has shown that throughout setbacks. And the nature of people that are in our industry want to be with people and want to supply services and want to give that to the people we serve at the end of the day. So that's not going to change. I'm very, very passionate about getting back to business and helping these hotels through these times. And I just hope the government, the media, and everybody supports that.